Welcome back to the Nuggets of Gold podcast and YouTube channel. It's been like probably around a month since we've recorded. Really not much going on in the NFL. This is kind of the only dead 6 weeks of the entire year for the NFL. So we didn't really have much to talk about. Just decided to take a break. Been going on vacation. I've been moving, so it just made sense to kind of wait up. But today we're going to kind of talk about something that happened about a week or two ago. Kyle Shanahan went on Sean McVay and Peter Schrager's podcast, and we just want to talk about some of the takeaways, in our opinions, of that podcast. And I'll also include the podcast below. It's about an hour and a half long if you want to listen to that as well. But I thought it was really insightful just to kind of hear Kyle talk about a couple things. Talked about the Super Bowl, talked about growing up with Mike Shanahan as his dad and also working for Mike. And then he talked about working with Matt LaFleur, Sean McVay, had some funny stories there. And just kind of talked about his overall just process of the game and just kind of and then ended up wrapping it up with like what it takes to be an NFL coach and some stuff like that. But I thought it was really cool. But Aiden, you want to just kind of start it off and talk about your favorite parts of that podcast?
Yeah, like you mentioned, there was a ton of super insightful, I guess, moments. We talked a little bit before about the funny lamination that McVay wasn't able to pull off. I don't want to spoil it too much, but the biggest takeaway for me, and a lot of this was reported on by different people, the biggest takeaway for me was what Shanahan looks for in his quarterbacks. He mentioned it pretty quickly, and they talked about the Mac Jones smoke. He said he thought it was interesting that everybody thought that he wanted a Kirk Cousins because Kirk is who he wanted when he originally got there. But he was like, I don't really need to pigeonhole myself into one guy. And he talked about how if you don't have you need something that makes you special. And he didn't talk about Lance specifically, but he did talk about the impact of being able to use your legs. And that's something that I think wasn't really talked about, but that's going to be huge if and when Lance takes over this year.
Yeah, well, and the thing about that is he's not going to get himself in a spot where he has, like you said, he gets pigeonholed and he has to take a Kirk-like guy. So that would be Mac Jones. And it was also funny that Sean McVay thought he was going to take Kyle Pitts. I thought that was hilarious. And Kyle was like, really? When he brought it up. But it is fascinating to see what Kyle wants to do with Lance. And like you said, he didn't really get into that. Of course, he's not going to give that away on a podcast. I'm sure he has a really unique plan for what he wants to do with him. But his is almost, he kind of talked about it as almost like a case-by-case basis. Like that's how he's going to view the guys. Okay, this guy might be good for this. Oh, I can do this with this guy. And so when he starts talking about that, you think about, all right, he has a clear plan with Lance of how he wants to utilize him. And that to me is the exciting part of that conversation is, and we talked about it before, with Trey Lance, the 49ers, and also then there's another team in the NFL, but them and one other team could go on a stretch where they are like two of the greatest running teams in the NFL and in NFL history. The other team, of course, is the Baltimore Ravens, but there's a chance that we might see some, 800-yard, 1,000-yard rushing seasons by Trey Lance. His ability is incredibly unique. And if he's able to translate that into the NFL like he did, and yes, he's not playing against great competition, but it also looked pretty much easy for him against that competition. So it'll be interesting to see how he kind of adapts when he gets into the league. But his physical running style is absurd, and it's going to be really cool to see what they want to do with him because he does have a unique skill set, and he does have something that most guys don't, and that is his ability to just go hit the hole really fast and also run guys over from a quarterback position. And I think they're going to be careful with them. You don't want it to end up like a Cam Newton situation where I don't know how I want to say Cam's like 31, 32 now. And his shoulder's been kind of done for a while. So you don't want to see it end up like something like that. But I'm sure they're going to find ways to incorporate Trey Lance into this rushing attack. And even if it's not that often, even if Trey Lance doesn't rush for those kind of numbers, the defense is going to always have to be honest and watch out for that. So I think they're going to incorporate a lot of really, really cool running facets into this game. And you're going to see guys like Elijah Mitchell and Trey Sermon potentially dominate in a couple years here when he takes over under center, which we don't know if that's this year, next year. So it's going to be cool, but I am very intrigued about that. Another part of this conversation that I really thought was cool was the hiring process. And basically, Kyle said that he wasn't really interested in the 49ers job. And if you look at where the 49ers were when that interview process took place, it makes a lot of sense. They were an ugly roster. They were bottom 2 in both offense and defense, coming off of a Chip Kelly offense that was pretty bad. And then, they had the hardball stuff, and they also had Jimmy Tomsula right before that. So like they had that 3 year of, we're going to fire a guy every year. And he did not like that. He hated this ability. Basically went into a meeting room with Jed, Parag, a couple other people, and they just figured it out. So that was really cool to see. But what were your thoughts about that conversation during that podcast part?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting. He made a point that we had talked about earlier when talking about the GMs. It's one of the hardest things to do in the NFL, to get fired and then rehired. And we talked about it with Martin Mayhew, who was able to pull it off, got the Niners an extra 3rd round pick, which was super nice. But Kyle said he didn't want to just be a NFL head coach. He wanted to stay an NFL head coach. And he had mentioned that he was fine waiting for the right job. And the 49ers ended up being that job once he talked to Jed and Parag. But I think that was a really interesting point, and something that people don't really consider. Like there's all this talk about Bieniemy and why he's not getting the interviews, and it could even just be that Bieniemy isn't all that interested in the jobs that come open. And obviously there's some different factors at play there, whether it be race or whether Andy Reid's calling the plays. But I think it's just important for fans to consider that coaches may not necessarily want to leave for what's seen as maybe a better job or maybe some sort of promotion. Because like, I don't think you would want to be like the Lions head coach right now. They just hired Dan Campbell, who was an offensive line coach. And he has his work cut out for him. That roster is not good. The Texans roster, not good. It's going to be tough to turn those teams around. And once you fail and you're Hugh Jackson, good luck getting another head coaching job. And I think that Kyle made a really good point when he talked about that.
It is interesting to hear that, because I mean, right now, like when we think about the 49ers, we think of a very stable organization. And if you go like 5 years ago, it was quite the opposite. So it's interesting how just bringing in a head coach and having that same plan too of, hey, we want to keep you here. And that might be a part of, why they had a 6-year deal. That might have been, and he didn't really talk about the 6-year deal stuff that much in that conversation, but that could be something he was like, look, I understand what you guys are saying, but if you guys mean it, I want a long-term deal, because that's my concern here is, I'm going to be a 1-year coach, not even have an opportunity to rebuild it, and then get fired and then never have a coaching job again. And then if that happens, this is the other problem. If you're a one-time head coach and then you do end up getting a second job, that second one becomes so much more important. You brought up Hugh Jackson, and he had the very bad record, the winless season. What about Adam Gase? I don't know if you know about this, Aiden, but Adam Gase right now is an offensive coordinator in high school.
Is he really?
And yes.
Couldn't even get a high school coaching job?
Yes, you didn't even get a college coordinating job. Not even a head coach high school job. He's a coordinator in high school.
Nick Saban didn't take him?
So you can really fall off a cliff, is my point. I mean, when he was on the Dolphins, when Jay Ajayi was doing great, he was viewed as like, oh, he's an up-and-coming coach. Stuff kind of falls apart with Miami, goes to New York, looks terrible, done. Like, it can fall off so quick. So it is cool to see like that was a big deal for Kyle. Also really funny just conversation about it, because he basically like slept in, almost missed the interview. And then he went back and talked to his wife and was like, hey, I actually think the 49ers job is my favorite. She was like, where did this come from? I don't understand. And then after that, I think the next cool part of this podcast was that they were talking, and this was Sean McVay and Kyle. They kind of both gave their insights to this, but they were talking about the Super Bowl losses, and more specifically the Falcons loss. Kyle did allude that the second half against the Chiefs was not called the way that he liked. Wasn't whining or complaining about it, but definitely voiced his concerns that he didn't feel like that was correctly called. And he dropped a couple funny little things like, oh yeah, in that Falcons game, we got this holding call. Wouldn't have been a holding call in the other Super Bowl, but and just kind of talked a little bit about the consistency of the reffing in the NFL. But they started talking about it. They even brought up the infamous Seahawks play where Malcolm Butler gets the interception and said like, hey, when you're looking at what's a successful play, a rub route right there, like that's a good play. And they were talking about it. And it was just interesting how these and what they were talking about is how narratives get made on, oh, you made this mistake. But in a lot of cases, and Kyle still feels this way, and McVay felt this way as well, that aggressiveness that he had in both those Super Bowls, he thought it was the right way to go about it and he went back to the Falcons Super Bowl a lot more because that's obviously the more heavily criticized one, going up 28-3 and all. And basically what he said was, we were in a point in the second half where we were in a 2nd and 10 situation, and it was in the fourth quarter. We had already been in a 2nd and 10 situation. We had ran the ball before. We didn't do anything. This time I wanted to get the ball to Julio because he had just had that really big catch, and they got sacked. And then they ended up getting a couple yards to get in the field goal range, and then they got a hold. And he was saying, like, the process was still correct. Maybe I shouldn't call that Julio play, but even on the 3rd down, we got enough yards to get in the field goal range to where we wanted. And it didn't happen. And he basically said, like, he tried to go for, like, that kill play, like, oh, we're going to end it. Like, we're going to end it right here. And he messed up. And so it was just interesting to talk about the processes of it and how even if you're super criticized, like, you got to go and do what you believe is the best way to win. And that's not going to change. Not like he's not going to adapt, but you still have to go about it in the right mindset. Not of like, oh, can't do this because then this will happen. Got to make sure to run the ball because at least people will understand that we're trying to run the clock out. Like, no, he's trying to go out there and he's going to call whatever play he feels is, the best way to win. And in both the Super Bowl cases, it hasn't worked out, but still got to go through the correct process. So what were your thoughts on him kind of addressing that?
I think that he said it better than anybody else could. It's his fundamental approach to play to win, not to play, not to lose. And I think in every game that Kyle coaches, he plays to win. He's aggressive, and whether the quarterback limits that or not, Kyle will not shy away and try to run the ball out for the clock and try to punt. Kyle is aggressive, and most of the time it hasn't worked in the 2 Super Bowl losses, but most of the time it ends up really, really working out and being a huge benefit. So I think that that's something that makes him a great play caller rather than something that can be criticized just because it didn't work out a couple times. It's kind of just bad luck.
That's what I feel as well. And you also look at like keeping that aggressiveness. And we brought up Trey Lance a little earlier, but maybe that's a guy they feel like, hey, when we get Trey Lance, we can be a lot more aggressive. And that might be, we might just try to run the ball down people's throats. We might do this. We might call some like odd play calls on 3rd and 8. But him being aggressive, I mean, you can be aggressive in so many different ways in terms of the NFL, on offense and defense. And so having the right personnel, like, and the other thing is like, there were also missed opportunities in both those games that were not Kyle's fault. Like there are missed opportunities where even if the plays don't work out, there's a reason that the plays don't work out, and that might not be on Kyle. So I do love the aggressiveness. I think that I've always attributed that to a lot of his success in the NFL, and why his offenses are always so great. So I don't know. I really enjoyed this podcast though. Anything else you wanted to add though? Because I feel like those were like the main points that I really took away and the stuff I like to hear about. But anything else that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing that I took from it, and we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, is that I don't think it's Trey versus Jimmy in a quarterback battle because they're able to do 2 completely different things. I think it's Trey versus when Kyle thinks he's ready. And a lot of people are going to try to compare Trey and Jimmy in terms of how many passes they complete. But I think the versatility that Trey adds is worth more to Kyle than I would have otherwise thought. And it's less of a Trey versus Jimmy quarterback battle and more of a Trey versus time. We talk about the Tom versus time. It's a little bit of a different time, but it's more when it's time for Trey to be ready. And that was my biggest takeaway.
Yeah, and that kind of, I guess that's a great way to wrap it up, because one of the things that I wanted to discuss today, because we're hopping back on the pod, we're going to be recording a lot more, hopefully posting almost daily content. But one of the main storyline that I'm going to try to cover is just a Trey Lance report, and I'm going to do it through like quicker videos, just kind of explaining, okay, this is how he looked today in practice, and going over each of his practice days. But that's something that by far is the biggest storyline for the 49ers this offseason, and really throughout the season as well. If he's not starting in games, guess what? There's still a ton to take away in practice, because you're going to get the Trey Lance reports. Oh, he did this in practice today. Oh, he looks so good. It's time for him to take over Jimmy Garoppolo's spot. We're going to see those headlines. We're going to see, oh, Trey looked terrible. He's not even ready. He's not going to start for 2 years. Like, you're going to see a bunch of crazy stuff. I'm going to try to do my best job of covering that to kind of see where it's at, because I think that is the most fascinating part of the 49ers season. And honestly, it's one of the biggest storylines in the NFL for this whole year. And maybe he doesn't even impact this NFL season, but it's still a crazy storyline to follow, because once he's Kyle's guy, I would say this is Kyle's like first true, like, I'm grooming him, top to bottom. Like, this is my guy. And so it's always cool if you get a quarterback like that for an elite offensive play caller. The last guy we had like that was Patrick Mahomes. So there's going to be some guys like that. Sean Payton, we saw him, turn around with Drew Brees, but he didn't even start with Drew Brees, and he's going to try to do the same thing with Winston. So, I mean, a lot of offensive play callers don't get that many chances to hand select a quarterback. And Kyle Shanahan, the 49ers, were lucky enough to be able to trade up to 3 and take a guy with immense talent in Trey Lance. So really going to cover that a lot. And Aiden, I think you are spot on. It's not a Trey Lance versus Jimmy Garoppolo. It is Trey Lance versus time, because he is very clearly the future of this team. And maybe that's not this year, but I think it's going to be pretty soon that we're going to see him out in the field. Maybe it is this year. If that's the case, that's going to be really exciting, because it's going to be when they think he's ready. I don't think it's going to be dependent on Jimmy Garoppolo, unless he's injured, of course. But I'm really looking forward to this, just tracking this story all season long. But I think that's going to do it for today's episode. We're excited to be back, and we're going to start getting a lot more content out as training camp starts up, and then, preseason, and then pretty soon the regular season as well. So really excited to be back, and we'll be bringing you guys 49ers content almost